The chamber was hushed, but the silence was anything but calm. Every face in the room was tightened with anticipation, every eye darting toward Ayanna Pressley as she leaned into the microphone. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. With a tone sharpened by conviction, she cut through the thick air like a blade. "Let's call it what it is," she began, steady and unflinching. "A party more interested in shielding predators than protecting the people they swore to serve." The words landed like thunder. For a brief second, even her opponents froze, as if they hadn't expected anyone to speak so plainly, so directly. Across the aisle, a few smirks faltered. Whispers rippled through the chamber like the first tremor of an earthquake. Jasmine Crockett, seated nearby, turned her head sharply. Even she knew this moment was different. Pressley's eyes scanned the room, unbothered by the scowls, unwavering in the face of disdain. She wasn't speaking for their approval. She was speaking to the millions outside those walls, the mothers fearing for their daughters, the workers betrayed by corruption, the communities ignored for generations. Her voice carried their stories, their anger, their demand for dignity, and in that instant the chamber didn't feel like marble and wood. It felt like a courtroom of history itself, with every word being weighed, recorded, and prepared for judgment. The Republicans shifted uncomfortably, their usual bluster caught off guard by the precision of her charge. But this was only the spark. Pressley hadn't come for a soundbite. She came to peel back the facade, to force a reckoning. Her words were not just an accusation. They were an opening shot in a confrontation that would reach beyond the Capitol walls, into the bloodstream of American politics, because what came next wouldn't simply expose a party's hypocrisy. It would reveal the stakes for every citizen who still believed that justice could triumph over arrogance. And as Pressley paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt unbearable, the question hung in the air. If this was the opening, what storm was about to break? The silence after Pressley's words didn't last long. Like a match dropped into dry grass, the chamber erupted. A few Republicans scoffed loudly, trying to dismiss her charge as partisan theatrics, but their protests rang hollow. For those, listening both inside and outside the Capitol, the truth had already pierced through the noise. This wasn't a passing exchange. It was a collision of two visions for America, one where power shields itself from accountability, and one where accountability is demanded, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the powerful feel. Pressley knew the weight of her statement. She had forced the issue into the open. Who exactly was being protected in this country, and who was being abandoned? These weren't abstract questions. They touched every family worried about abuse swept under the rug, every survivor whose voice had been silenced, every voter sick of double standards that favored the well-connected. The Republican response, predictable yet desperate, was to wave it off. They laughed under their breath, shook their heads, leaned on their rehearsed talking points. But their unease betrayed them. For years they had mastered the art of deflection, spinning scandals into distractions, turning outrage into exhaustion. Yet this moment felt different. The accusation was too precise, too raw, too undeniable. And outside those walls, Americans were listening with growing impatience. A nation already battered by inequality and disillusionment was asking whether its leaders stood for justice or for impunity. The stakes weren't confined to one hearing or one headline. They stretched into the very question of whether democracy could protect its people or whether it would fold under the weight of hypocrisy. For allies of Pressley, this was more than politics. It was moral clarity. Her words echoed a truth that too many had whispered in frustration but had rarely heard spoken aloud in the halls of power. That protecting predators, whether in politics, in corporations, or in institutions, corrodes the very foundation of trust that holds a nation. Together, the risk was enormous. To say what she had said so openly was to draw a line that could not be erased. Republicans would surely retaliate, painting her as divisive, reckless, unpatriotic. The media would circle, framing the clash as another partisan battle. But that was the point. Pressley wasn't trying to avoid the fight. She was daring them to confront it. And in doing so, she shifted the battlefield. The debate was no longer about personalities or party talking points. It was about the safety, of the vulnerable, the honesty of leadership, the courage to stand in the open and call corruption by its name. That shift left her opponents scrambling, because it asked a question they couldn't easily answer. If you strip away the slogans, what side are you really on? By raising the stakes, Pressley didn't just challenge her colleagues. She forced the nation to reckon with itself. Were Americans prepared to accept leaders who hid behind procedure while shielding predators? Or would they demand leaders willing to protect the people, even at great political cost? And as that question lingered, the stage was set for the next act. One where the villains of this story, arrogant and emboldened by years of unchecked power, would reveal exactly why they feared voices like hers. For years, the Republican Party had perfected a mask of righteousness. They draped themselves in the language of family values, faith, and tradition, a performance polished enough to convince some, but hollow enough that cracks were always showing. Behind closed doors, scandals piled up. Powerful figures who preached morality were caught shielding colleagues accused of harassment, brushing aside credible reports, or using their influence to silence victims. Each time they escaped accountability through spin, distraction, or brute political muscle. The hypocrisy was staggering. A party that claimed to defend children routinely looked away when abuse was exposed in institutions it favored. Leaders, who railed against moral decay, were quick to excuse predators when those predators wore the right colors on their lapel. And when confronted, their instinct was always the same: dismiss, deny, deflect. It wasn't just a strategy, it had become a culture of impunity. That culture shaped their arrogance in the chamber. Many Republicans entered debates with an air of untouchable confidence, smirking as if the truth could never stick to them. They believed the public would grow numb, that the cycle of outrage would burn out before consequences arrived. Time and again, they had been proven right. Scandal after scandal faded under the weight of another news cycle. Survivors were left behind while the machine marched on, louder and stronger. But arrogance has a way of blinding those who wield it. By insulating themselves from accountability, Republicans convinced themselves they were invincible. They mistook the silence of exhausted citizens for approval, when in truth it was boiling frustration waiting for a voice. This was the opening Pressley seized. Her words pierced their armor because she attacked not just an isolated incident, but the very pattern they relied upon to survive. By calling them defenders of predators, she forced the mask off, daring the public to see them without the gloss of slogans and staged speeches. And that truth cut deeper than any partisan jab. The villains of this story weren't caricatures of greed or cruelty. They were men and women who had grown so accustomed to protecting one another that they no longer saw the corruption in their own reflection. They had become a party comfortable with shielding the powerful while ignoring the vulnerable, and that comfort would be their downfall. As the chamber sat heavy with her words, the Republicans tried to shrug it off. But deep down, they understood the danger. For the first time in a long while, someone had laid bare the contradiction they could not explain away, and while they scrambled to hide their discomfort, another story was quietly waiting to rise. The story of the woman who dared to confront them, armed not with arrogance, but with truth forged in her own struggle. Ayanna Pressley did not enter politics through the gilded doors of privilege. Her journey began in the very neighborhoods that often felt forgotten by the powerful. Raised by a single mother in Chicago, she witnessed firsthand the struggles of working families who balanced two jobs just to keep the lights on. She carried with her the lessons of resilience taught not in textbooks, but in lived experience, lessons that sharpened her resolve long before she ever stood behind a microphone. Pressley's path was never easy. She endured moments of isolation, of being underestimated, of hearing the unspoken judgment that someone who looked like her, someone who spoke like her, wasn't supposed to sit at the table of power. But instead of shrinking, she built armor out of those moments. Every insult became fuel. Every barrier became proof that her voice was not only necessary, but urgent. When she arrived in Congress, she carried more than policy proposals. She carried the stories of her community, survivors who demanded justice, young women determined to claim their future, families who had been told to wait patiently while the system ignored their pain. She became their megaphone in the very spaces designed to silence them. What set her apart was not just her ability to speak, but her refusal to flinch. Pressley never hid. Her identity never diluted her convictions to make others comfortable. She understood that politics wasn't simply about votes. It was about visibility, about telling the people who had been invisible for too long that they finally had someone who saw them, who would not betray them when the lights dimmed. Her strength wasn't abstract. It was forged in real battles. From fighting for criminal justice reform to standing against discriminatory policies, she confronted power not with arrogance, but with persistence. She didn't trade in slogans. She traded in lived truth. And that authenticity made her impossible to ignore. To her critics, she was radical. To her supporters, she was revolutionary. But to those who knew her story, she was simply consistent. The same woman who had walked through hardship now, standing firmly against injustice. That consistency made her dangerous to those who thrived on hypocrisy. When she looked across the aisle and accused Republicans of protecting predators, she was not making a calculated play for headlines. She was speaking from the same place that had carried her through every storm, the unshakable conviction that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and complicity to her was never an option. In that chamber, her words carried the weight of years of struggle, sacrifice, and service. They weren't just political lines. They were the distilled essence of a life spent proving that courage could outlast corruption. And as she drew strength from her own history, the clash moved into its next stage. The Republicans, rattled but unwilling to retreat, would push harder. The debate was about to escalate, insults sharpening into open confrontation. What they didn't realize was that Pressley's entire journey had prepared her for this very moment, the storm she had been waiting to meet head-on. The chamber could only hold its breath for so long. Pressley's challenge had cracked the mask, but now the response came fast and sharp. A Republican voice cut through the air, dismissive and dripping with condescension. This is just another partisan attack, another distraction from the real issues. The smirks returned, louder this time, as if repetition could make their denial sound like truth. Others piled on, invoking tired lines about law and order, about protecting the sanctity of institutions, lines that rang hollow against the accusations Pressley had just leveled. Theatrics disguised as outrage, arrogance paraded as authority. Jasmine Crockett, caught in the middle of the exchange, shifted uneasily. Though she wasn't the direct target, the collision unfolding before her was impossible to ignore. The temperature in the room was rising, each sentence tightening the tension like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Pressley did not back down. She leaned in again, her voice steady, refusing to be drowned out. "Real issues?" she asked, her tone slicing through the chamber. "What issue could be more real than protecting our people from predators?" The words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the kind of calm precision that unsettles opponents more than rage ever could. Yet the Republicans bristled. Their strategy was clear. Overwhelm her with noise, with dismissals, with the false confidence of those who had gotten away with it before. One lawmaker raised his voice, accusing her of cheap shots. Another called her remarks reckless. The volume climbed, a wall of sound meant to smother her. But with every outburst, their discomfort grew more visible. They gestured wildly, exchanged nervous glances, clung to their scripts as though the paper itself might protect them. And in the gallery above, observers leaned forward. The confrontation had become theater, the stakes no longer abstract but visceral. It was more than a debate. It was a trial, with the public serving as jury. For a moment it seemed the Republicans might succeed in creating chaos, in making the exchange too messy for the truth to land. But Pressley did not flinch. Her expression was composed, her words deliberate, her timing impeccable. The contrast was striking, their noise against her clarity, their bluster against her calm. Each minute that passed deepened the divide. What began as a spark of confrontation had grown into a full storm. Voices clashing, accusations flying, the chamber vibrating with tension. Yet beneath the surface, something else was building. The audience could sense it. Pressley hadn't unleashed her full strength yet. She was waiting, calculating, letting her opponents burn themselves out in a frenzy of denial and dismissal. And as they grew louder, her silence between words became louder still, a silence that promised the blow was coming. Because this wasn't the climax. This was only the escalation, the tightening of the noose. And when she finally chose to strike, the room would not be the same. The chamber roared with noise, but Pressley didn't raise her voice to match it. She waited. She let the interruptions and denials hang in the air, allowed the chaos to expose itself. And then, with a calmness that silenced the storm, she spoke. "You tell us to focus on the real issues. Let me be clear. Protecting predators is not a partisan issue. It is a moral one." The words dropped heavy, undeniable. A hush rippled across the room. Even those who had been shouting seconds earlier faltered, realizing the trap had closed. In her voice there was no hesitation, no need for theatrics. She wasn't arguing. She was delivering judgment. Pressley leaned forward, locking eyes with her opponents. "You preach about family values, yet time and again, you defend those who exploit the vulnerable. You hold yourselves up as guardians of morality, but when confronted with predators in your ranks, your response is silence, or worse, excuses." Every sentence struck with surgical precision. She listed cases where accountability was dodged, where victims were pushed aside, where Republican leaders offered cover instead of condemnation. She didn't need to exaggerate. The facts alone were damning. "They tell survivors to be brave," she continued, her tone tightening. "But when survivors speak, they look away. They talk about justice, but only when it is convenient. And when it threatens their power, they protect the predator, not the people." Gasps echoed in the chamber. Some shifted uncomfortably, others avoided eye contact altogether. Crockett watched intently, her expression caught between awe and disbelief. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a demolition, the careful collapse of a facade built on arrogance. One Republican tried to interject, his voice trembling with anger. But Pressley didn't give ground. She paused, letting his words stumble into the silence. Then, with devastating calm, she delivered the line that would ricochet across the country. "History will not remember your excuses. It will remember that when you had the chance to protect the vulnerable, you chose to protect the predators." The chamber froze. That sentence, simple yet lethal, carried the weight of generations of betrayal and the promise of future accountability. In that instant, the balance shifted. The Republicans' swagger dissolved into visible unease. Their bluster couldn't mask the truth anymore, and the silence that followed was louder than any applause. Pressley leaned back, not triumphant, but resolute. Her mic drop wasn't about spectacle, it was about truth. She had turned the chamber into a mirror, forcing her opponents to look at themselves, and they did not like the reflection. But this moment wasn't confined to those walls. Even as the chamber sat stunned, the echoes were already racing outward, preparing to ignite the nation beyond. The chamber sat in stunned silence, but outside those walls, the eruption was instant. Within minutes, clips of Pressley's takedown were spreading across social media like wildfire. The line, "History will not remember your excuses. It will remember that when you had the chance to protect the vulnerable, you chose to protect the predators," was clipped, captioned, and shared until it dominated timelines. Hashtags exploded. "Charm Pressley slams GOP," "Protect the people," and even a blunt, chakra mic drop moment trended nationwide. On TikTok, teenagers stitched her speech with their own commentary, calling it the line they wished every politician had the courage to say. On Twitter, survivors of abuse retweeted her words with a mix of relief and vindication, finally hearing a leader articulate what had been buried for too long. News anchors scrambled to catch up. Overnight programs replayed the clip, some with admiration, others with discomfort, but none able to ignore it. Progressive commentators hailed it as the moment the facade of Republican family values was shattered in real time. Conservative voices, visibly rattled, tried to spin it as an overreach, but the damage was done. Even celebrities weighed in. Musicians, actors, and athletes posted her quote with fire emojis, amplifying it to millions more. The cultural ripple effect was undeniable. This was no longer just congressional drama, it had become a national reckoning. And in Washington, the reaction was just as telling. Republican staffers scrambled to draft statements, attempting to downplay the exchange. But the split screen on cable news told the story better than any press release. On one side, Pressley, delivering her words with precision. On the other, Republicans fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, trapped in the glare of truth. For her allies, the moment was electrifying. Jasmine Crockett, still processing the force of what she'd witnessed, leaned into colleagues, whispering what many were already thinking. This changes everything. The chamber that had been a battleground only hours before now felt like a stage where history had shifted course. The shockwaves reached communities across the country. Parents quoted her to their children at the dinner table. Survivors shared her words in private support groups, describing how they felt seen for the first time. Teachers used the clip to spark classroom debates about accountability, justice, and leadership. The resonance was unmistakable. What Pressley had done wasn't just win an argument. She had cracked open a national conversation too long buried under spin and silence. And that conversation was not going away. But beneath the celebration lingered a deeper question. Would this moment simply live as a viral clip, or could it be harnessed into real change? The answer would depend on what came next, how her words would be carried beyond the noise into the moral heart of the nation itself. The viral clip had already done its work. Millions had watched, shared, and debated it. But the deeper impact wasn't in the numbers. It was in the questions her words left behind. When Ayanna Pressley said, "History will not remember your excuses. It will remember that when you had the chance to protect the vulnerable, you chose to protect the predators." She wasn't just speaking to the Republicans in that chamber. She was speaking to the country. To every voter, every parent, every survivor, every young person trying to make sense of politics that often feels distant and self-serving. Her message was simple. Accountability is not optional. For too long, excuses had been the currency of power. Leaders wrapped themselves in slogans about morality and values, but when the test came, when actual victims needed protection, they looked away. Pressley's words ripped off that mask. She reminded America that politics is not just about party wins or losses. It's about the lives that hang in the balance when leaders choose silence over justice, and that truth carried a moral weight no spin could erase. Crockett, reflecting afterward, noted that what stunned her wasn't just the sharpness of Pressley's delivery. It was the courage. Courage to say the thing others whispered about behind closed doors. Courage to expose the hypocrisy in real time, in the very space where power was supposed to hide it. That kind of courage is rare, and it changes people when they witness it. The moral lesson here is clear. Leadership is not measured by the titles we hold, but by the people we defend. Protecting the vulnerable, standing with survivors, and calling out hypocrisy are not acts of partisanship, they are acts of humanity. And when leaders fail to do that, history will not forgive them. But the resolution doesn't rest on Pressley alone. It rests on the people who heard her words. Viral clips fade, outrage trends come and go. What remains is whether citizens decide to carry that clarity forward, into conversations, into organizing, into the voting booth. Because the fight against predators, and against the systems that shield them, is bigger than one chamber, one speech, or one moment. It's a test of what kind of society we are willing to be. Pressley passed her test with courage. The question now is whether America will do the same, and that, in the end, is the lesson her mic drop left behind. True power isn't in protecting the powerful. True power is in protecting the people. And as the chamber settled, and the echoes of Ayanna Pressley's words still lingered, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not just politics. This was a battle for the soul of a nation. Nation deciding, in real time, whether to protect the powerful or to protect the people. Her words were not meant to end with applause or headlines. They were meant to live on in the hearts of those who refuse to be silent. And that's where you come in. Because this moment, this clash of courage versus cowardice, doesn't just belong to the history books. It belongs to you. Every time you share this story, every time you refuse to let hypocrisy go unchecked, every time you demand better from those in power, you become part of the resistance that refuses to bow down. And here's the thing. These stories don't fade when we hold them together. They grow stronger. They create movements. They remind us that dignity is more powerful than cruelty, that truth cuts sharper than any smear, and that justice, though delayed, always finds its way back. So if you believe in that, if you believe that leadership means protecting the vulnerable, not excusing the predators, then don't just watch. Be part of this. Join this community. Subscribe now, so you never miss the moments when truth breaks through the noise. Share this video, so the story of courage doesn't get buried under excuses. Leave your voice in the comments, because history is written not just by the powerful, but by the people who refuse to forget. The fight continues. The truth will not stay hidden. And together, we'll make sure the mic drop moments of courage echo far louder than the silence of complicity.